Hello everyone, welcome to this self-paced course on designing inclusive teaching resources. I'm Gabriella, an academic developer in the Centre for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. I've chosen this background image purposefully because I wanted to illustrate how difficult it can be to read text on a page when an image or background image is very busy, and when the page is very crowded, and when there's some redundant information on the page. For example, you can see two logos there. The color contrast is also very poor in some parts. As you can see, the word teaching is hard to read. So this is an example of what not to do when you're designing inclusive teaching resources. It's much better if your resources look something like that. It's not as fancy, but you can guarantee that it's much easier for most people to read. So that is much of the content of this self-paced course. Some simple things you can do that go a really, really long way. Before we begin, I found a lovely quote I wanted to share with you by Verna Rossi. She is also an academic developer. She came to our symposium at UEL in 2020, and she has a very nice website that really focuses on inclusive teaching and learning in higher education. I've linked that in one of the videos later on in this self-paced course. I strongly recommend it. This sentence that she wrote in one of her posts really stood out for me. And it might mean different things to different people. But when I read it, inclusivity fosters more inclusivity, I thought that is exactly right, because there's really no limit to how much you can make a learning experience inclusive for your students. We'll be constantly learning from our students every day as we continue to teach in higher education. And we'll make mistakes. We will not realize things that we were doing that don't work. It's a very iterative process. We'll continue to grow and learn. But if you are on the path of ensuring that your modules and the learning experience overall is as inclusive as possible for all students, you will notice that your awareness in this area just continually increases. And it's actually quite an enjoyable process, I find. The other thing is you will learn from your students as you go along, so keeping that open dialogue is also very important, offering alternatives and so on. So now on to the course aims. The first aim, to ensure what designing inclusive to understand what designing inclusive teaching resources is and why it matters. Number 2, to reflect on your previous experiences in planning and designing resources. And 3, to understand the simple steps you can take to ensure your own inclusive teaching resource design. So this self-paced course is ideal for those people who want to take action in very tangible ways as soon as possible. These are some of the small things you can do that go a really long way. So now on to a reflection, your teaching experiences. I want you to think back to a time when you did not know how to support a student with a particular learning need or preference. How did it make you feel? Think back to the precise experience. What happened to that student in the end? How did the institution support you and the student in that process? You can pause this video and take a moment to think about that. And the reason I ask this question is because if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 or more years experience of teaching in further or higher education, this will be something that you've come across. And sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. But you've probably noticed over the years that universities have become increasingly aware, and they are developing resources and services continually to address students with particular learning needs or preferences. So, just want to start off with a few useful key terms. Here are some questions for you. What is the difference between inclusivity and accessibility? We often use the two interchangeably, but is there a difference? In which case, why have I referred to inclusive teaching resource design rather than accessible teaching resource design in this self-paced course? Here's another question. What does inclusive teaching and learning actually mean? It's a very broad term. So what could it encompass? And finally, how can the way we design our teaching resources affect how inclusive our modules are for our students? Well, I don't have very specific answers to all of these questions, perhaps apart from the first one, which I can summarize for you now. Inclusivity is the broader term. We can say it's the umbrella term, it's the more holistic term. And accessibility usually refers to something more specific relating to assistive technologies and the way that digital technologies and resources are used to make them as accessible to all students as possible. Inclusivity, accessibility obviously in that case falls under inclusivity. So I'm speaking more broadly here about inclusive resource design. And what does inclusive teaching and learning actually mean? Well, again, as I said before, the sky is the limit with inclusive teaching and learning. You might want to broaden and broaden and broaden as you become more acquainted with things you can do with your students on your modules and in your classrooms. For example, inclusive teaching could include harnessing a sense of belonging in your students, and it could include taking a culturally responsive approach to the content that you learn. Yes. And the third question, how can the way we design our teaching resources affect how inclusive our modules are for our students? Well, what you'll find is the simple steps that I'm going to show you mean that you pretty much address most learning needs and preferences if you follow these steps to the way you design your resources. And by that, I'm talking about font, style, colour, how busy the content is on the page, in the things that you give to your students, such as PowerPoint slides, PDFs, Word documents, and other digital resources in particular. In addition to that, we also need to think about how we use the language, so how we phrase instructions and things like that, which unfortunately we won't go into today. But really, designing teaching resources is not just about the look. The way we phrase sentences will make a difference. And also, if you think about it, the kind of visual imagery we use makes a difference as well, because representation is important. And so on. As I said, the sky is the limit. So I just wanted to go over a few more key terms, and what I can say is you might have come across these terms before: usable design, universal design, accessible design, and inclusive design. And these all mean slightly different things, but they are all focused really on enhancing the student experience. And I've taken the liberty of putting these in order. So I view these terms as incrementally increasing the student experience or enhancing the student experience. So usable design, very similar to the way we talk about user experience. If you are in social media, if you're working in social media and marketing and so on, web design. So making it user friendly. And then universal design is trying to take a one-size-fits-all approach, which is kind of what we're doing today. We're trying to address in broad strokes inclusivity in the way we design our resources. As I said before, accessibility or accessible design falls under inclusive design, but inclusive design is much broader. As I said, it could include the images you choose to use and what representation they contain, who they are representing, do the students feel represented in those images, and the way we phrase the language, the kind of examples we draw upon to connect students to their learning, and so on. So that's just a little outline of some of these questions, of some of these key terms you'll come across. So what is inclusive teaching resource design? To summarize, it's the process of creating teaching resources that are accessible to people with a wide range of abilities, disabilities, and backgrounds, not just disabilities, which is what we've typically referred to when we've talked about inclusivity and accessibility. It's much broader than that. A wide range of abilities, disabilities, and backgrounds, cultural, and so on. Inclusively designed teaching resources, though, are compatible with assistive technologies, which I mentioned earlier, which is a component of accessibility. And however, in recent years, inclusivity has acquired a much broader and holistic meaning than accessibility alone, which of course is still a priority.